Welcome once more to The Broken Covenant, a grimdark fantasy episodic audio narrative authored and narrated by Miles A. Drake. If you haven't already watched Episode 1, The Sacrifice, I strongly suggest that you do so, as this narrative will proceed chronologically and missing an episode will likely result in unwanted confusion. Also, due to me drastically upgrading my microphone situation and no longer having to use a toaster to record, I have re-uploaded the first episode. On that note, I do apologize for the delay in releasing this episode. Now, for a quick summary of the story thus far, Ezekiel and his brothers of the Knights Justicar venture deep into the inversion, a blight upon the face of reality, on a quest of great importance, though what that quest is remains yet unknown to Ezekiel. And remember, if you enjoy this, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and bell icon buttons. Doing so may help this series and my channel get noticed by those who might enjoy it. Thus, without further distraction, I present Book 1, Ezekiel, Chapter 2, Death for the Wretched. As night fell, the band of Justicars made camp on the upper floor of a crumbling basilica dome. The haze lifted, and the clear night air revealed the dead city with a measure of clarity. Ezekiel kept vigil, staring out from a broken gap in the dome to watch the distant fires. Many of those fires were the echoes of the flame that had once scoured this place of life, burning even after 400 years, fed by the souls trapped in the festering landscape. Those flames were the remnants of Samael's desolation. They were what remained of Elohim's wrath, enacted by his left hand. Samael and his choir of burning mashit had scorched Hinnom black 400 years ago, cauterizing the gaping wound in reality wrought by the Brazen King's heinous ritual. It hadn't been enough. The wound was festering once more, and now its infection was spreading. In the distance, Ezekiel thought he heard shouting, wails of anguish, and the laughter of the mad. It vanished as the wind shifted. Some of those distant fires were wholly more mundane in nature, belonging to the camps of the madmen that flocked to the inversion, or spilled out from it. Houndsmen, they were called. They were the refuse, the rabid lapdogs sworn to the cult of the Brazen King. They were a symptom inflicted upon mankind by the infection. During Ezekiel's early years, the Houndsmen had been a source of many a dark tale. They were the boogeymen, the vile, masked lunatics that reaved, slaved, and slaughtered their way across the Empire, preying upon isolated villages and travelers. Since his knighthood, Ezekiel had seen the truth to those tales firsthand many a time. Houndsman incursions had become all the more frequent since then, a source of much alarm amidst the Empire's leadership. The luminaries and the theurgist orders alike had divined that some dark presence was driving them onwards. Ezekiel suspected that was why he and his brothers were here. Part of Ezekiel longed to draw his sword and march out into that darkness, towards one of those flames. He longed to wet his blade in the blood and viscera of the degenerate men that had forfeited their humanity before the allure of corruption. The thirst for vengeance welled up within him, stronger than ever, pulling at him to indulge, to give in to his desire and enact justice upon the damned. "No," he hissed. His desire was not a desire for justice. It was clear enough what it was. It was simple bloodlust, fueled by the all-too-human ecstasy of revenge. It twisted through him, clouding rational thought, gnawing at his resolve. That indulgence, however righteous it might pretend to be, was trying to lead him astray. "I will not succumb," he whispered to himself. It would feed on doubt. The indulgence would numb pain and regret. The very numbness would become an addiction, enslaving the mind and soul to become a vessel for the craving, freed of all inhibition. The numbness was the corruption. Ezekiel knew that clearly enough. He had been trained by the theurgists to know the corruption so that he might see and destroy it. Most of the Empire's common folk did not have access to such knowledge. The sermons of the Covenant's deacons and vicars warned of such indulgence, of course. But there were certain truths that could not be known by those who were not ready for such knowledge. Knowing was dangerous. Knowing the promises of indulgence was, in and of itself, a temptation. Ezekiel closed his eyes and heard the voices once more. The maddening whispers, the screams. He was assaulted by visions of burning farmsteads and smoking fields. A grotesque altar of flayed flesh and bone stood within the smoldering ruin of a defiled chapel, surrounded by slave wagons drawn by emaciated horses. Each of the rusted metal carts was filled with bloodied, naked bodies. Ragged figures stalked across burning fields and through scorched ruins, loping like predators in the shapes of men. Madness shone from their eyes as they corralled and hunted the panicked survivors. Another figure stood before the blasphemous altar, astride the dismembered corpses of clergymen and vestals alike. He was tall, clad in tarnished plate and draped in tattered crimson robes. A faintly smoking sword was clutched, point down in both hands, its tip rammed through the open mouth of a butchered priest. Smoke coiled strangely around the fallen knight, writhing as though drawn to him, and as Ezekiel's vision panned around the figure, he saw the tarnished barbute hidden beneath the knight's cowl. Bloodshot eyes that would never again know the peace of sleep stared at Ezekiel as if in challenge. He recognized the helm and the armor, and worse, he recognized the eyes. They were his own. He jolted awake with a retching cough, spitting black phlegm through the vertical visor slit of his helm. He cursed himself for having fallen asleep. Such could mean death for his brothers. While the Malak kept its sleepless vigil below, watching the direct route into the basilica, Ezekiel knew there were other dangers, winged things that could descend from the lightless sky above. When he returned home, he would submit to the sevenfold lashes. He blinked. He would never return home to the Justicar Temple, and there would be no penance. He would never see Solomon's Rest again. Not even death would release him from this nightmare. Such was his lot. Such was the fate Elohim had chosen for him. In an instant, he felt spite boil. Spite at God for having condemned him to this nightmare, even after 2 decades of devotion and loyalty. His lips curled back into a snarl as he glared up into the night sky. "Why?" he hissed. "Why me? Why Luthiel?" That last question hurt even more. Knowing that she would endure his fate alongside him made it all the more terrible. "If I must accept an eternity of suffering to complete your task, then so be it. But why her? Has she not suffered enough in your He fell silent. He was speaking blasphemy. He was questioning the will of the Archon, who alone spoke to the voice of God. The malign air swirled around him, choking, stifling. Ezekiel remembered the face of the fallen knight in his nightmare, and realized that of all the horrors he would face here in the inversion, the worst he would have to contend with was something far more insubstantial. Doubt. Corruption sprouted from the seed of doubt, and that seed was long planted. Ezekiel would be forced to face his true self, concealed within the armor of indoctrination. It was a long-forgotten nemesis, one that he assumed had been vanquished during his trials of purity. He had been knighted, and then he had sworn the Justicar's oaths. But before then, he had been something else. He wrapped his gauntlet against his helm, the clang clearing the subversive thoughts, at least for a moment. They were constant now, consuming every idle moment of wakefulness. "This place," he whispered to nothing, and set himself against whatever doubts the remainder of the night might afflict him with. When dawn finally came, the sun's polluted radiance illuminated the crumbling spires and broken domes just as the smoky fog began to reclaim the city, seeping up from the poisonous tar as it reacted to the light. Ezekiel, having passed his watch on to Javanael, awoke with the others. They all slept in their armor. It could not be removed, for the warding seals on their plate were all that kept the true horror of the inversion from consuming them. Sleep was near impossible, but fatigue and exhaustion were preferable to the alternative. The entire party reeked, and Ezekiel glanced around. Some of the knights had raised their visors to gnaw on the paltry rations they still had. The rations had been laced by fumes of molten quicksilver and baked in alchemical furnaces. They were toxic, even fatal in the long term, but it was the only thing that could remain edible in the inversion. Ezekiel uncorked a rune-inscribed flask. The liquid within tasted metallic and bright, if such a word could be used to describe taste. A mere sip of the Azoth formula would tide him over. It nourished the soul, which in turn nourished the flesh. It was an exceptionally rare formula, crafted by master alchemists alone, but the Arcanate had access to nearly any resource, and no expense had been spared upon the task undertaken by the Justicars. Ezekiel saw Sathariel drink from a similar flask. The High Justicar's face, now visible, was strained and gaunt, his skin pallid. One eye was bloodshot to the point of being nearly entirely red. Oozing crimson scar tissue radiated from around that eye, spiraling outward in a counterclockwise fashion. Under other circumstances, such a mark would warrant the attention of the Sicarian Order and, inevitably, the Witchpire. But here, it was to be expected. The marks of corruption would display sin and doubt upon the very flesh. It gave Ezekiel some comfort to know that even Sathariel suffered from such. It made his own fraying conviction feel less like a weakness that was his alone. Ezekiel unwrapped one of his last ration packs. and fit a piece of foul-tasting jerky through the slit of his helm. The Azoth formula did not replace the need to eat, it merely delayed and muted it. Glancing around, he saw Luthiel. She still lay, curled up beneath her ragged blanket. Moving to her side, he saw that her breath came in ragged rasps. She'd removed her mask, though her face was still obscured beneath the bandages. He knelt and shook her shoulder. She wheezed something that could have been a word in response, and Ezekiel helped her into a sitting position. Strands of wispy black hair hung loose from under her hood. Taking her hand, he felt two of her fingers missing beneath her bandages. "How is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse and cracked. She shook her head and began fumbling for her flask. She dropped it as a fit of coughing overwhelmed her. Red fluid seeped through the bandages covering her mouth. Retrieving the flask, he uncorked it and assisted her. As she drank, the bandages parted, revealing bloodied, blackened lips. Ezekiel grit his teeth and looked away. Insistently, Luthiel reached into a pouch in her robe and drew her golden mask, but fumbled as she attempted to put it on. Ezekiel took it and looped the straps around the back of her head, placing the mask over her face before drawing up her cowl once more. Once, Luthiel had remained stubborn in the face of her affliction, refusing help even from Ezekiel. He had respected her for that. But that had stopped after they'd crossed the mountains and entered the inversion. Her defiance bled away with her remaining life. Ezekiel wanted to weep. He wanted to hold the woman that had saved his life and soul close, and promise her that everything would be okay. But it would not. He would not lie to her, for her sake and his own. If he spoke it, he would try to believe it, and that belief would bring with it false hope. And more so than anything else, false hope sundered the soul. "You should eat something," he offered, reaching into his own satchel to find a piece of jerky. Luthiel shook her head. "I have eaten my last," she managed. "Azoth tincture, and the radiance within will sustain my body until I can no longer hold its fire." Ezekiel exhaled slowly. It was nothing he didn't expect, but hearing the admission of Luthiel's imminent demise from her own lips was agonizing. She looked at him, her bloodshot eyes visible beneath her mask. "I welcomed his light," she coughed, every word a struggle. "I took it into myself, knowing what it would one day do. The light of God was never meant for man." The imposing shape of Sathariel approached. "How does she fare?" he asked. Ezekiel shook his head. Luthiel coughed again, before looking up at the High Justicar. "I pray we reach the Citadel soon. I cannot protect you for long." "Mesashesh says it is less than a day away," Sathariel said, inclining his helmeted head. "Stay with us as long as you can, Lightbringer." Luthiel nodded. Ezekiel gazed blankly at nothing. When Luthiel died, the rest of them would follow, rapidly. "Everyone on their feet," Sathariel commanded, turning to the other Justicars. The Malak still waited below. "The refuse flocks to the Citadel, so be ready. I doubt we'll make it to our destination untested." Ezekiel grit his teeth. "Good," he whispered to himself. If fate gave him an excuse to exercise his vengeance, then he would not resist that particular indulgence. With that, the party set out, stepping into the racked streets of the blasted city. Once more, the vista assaulted Ezekiel's eyes, and once more he found himself utterly repulsed by the grotesque horror of the landscape, revealed by the mocking light of day. Somehow, in the darkness, the terror of the inversion had become a muted thing, hidden away by the veil of night. But under the glare of the wrathful sun, whose punishing fury had scoured this place once before, it became all the more horrific. The faces of the molten dead stared with accusation, and the shapes of their distorted forms, clambering over each other, fused and frozen, seemed somehow hateful. It was as though the inversion revealed its true, hideous form just to spite the light that shone down upon it. Eventually, the party passed one of the fires Ezekiel had seen in the night. It was an aberration of flame, billowing a vaporous golden orange. It emitted no smoke, and faint, writhing shapes coiled within it, wailing with distant voices. The husks surrounding the flame all appeared to kneel before it, Their blackened flesh split to reveal tendrils of wispy fire that spiraled towards the strange pyre. Luthiel stopped, leaning against Ezekiel's shoulder as she stared at the blaze.
The dead are doorways, trapped between worlds. The flow of souls is inverted. Souls rise from the Sheol, moths to the flame.
Ezekiel shivered. Samael, the left hand of God, had done this. The true horror of the inversion had unfolded before Samael's arrival, but the left hand had obliterated the ancient, profaned city of Hinnom, and burnt its cavorting demonic denizens to ash. Samael was a Malak, one of the two most powerful of their kind to grace the mortal world. That part of the horror spreading out before Ezekiel had been caused by such a divine being unsettled him greatly. It made him glance warily at the lesser Malak that stood among them. As usual, it stood apart from the rest of the group, its shrouded visage seemingly beholding nothing, though the eyes adorning its four wings appeared to gaze intently into the vaporous flame. Ezekiel frowned as he noticed shining cracks in the Malak's exposed porcelain flesh. He was fairly certain he hadn't seen them yesterday. He was also fairly certain the Malak's feathers, or what passed for such, hadn't been nearly as wilted as they seemed now. Most looked shriveled, like rotten leaves instead of avian plumage. A disconcerting thought passed through Ezekiel's mind. Was it dying too? He blinked. The Malak's iridescent eyes, all 28 of them, were staring at him. His flesh spasmed, and his muscles went rigid. His gaze involuntarily flinched away from the divine being's manifold stare. Bowing his head, he turned back to Luthiel, and ushered her along as the party began to move once more. Ezekiel was eager to be away from the aberrant flame, and eager to stave off the inactivity that beckoned his eyes to stray towards that which should forever remain unbeheld. Keeping his gaze away from the Malak, he did his best to restrain his thoughts, and keep his focus on the more tangible dangers that could be hidden nearby. And it wasn't long until those dangers revealed themselves. As the party crossed over an immense collapsed aqueduct, tilted onto its side and long eroded, Mosael, the party's vanguard, called the alarm from its ridge.
"Houndsmen! 3 dozen at least! They've seen us!"
He gestured towards the other side of the aqueduct. Ezekiel left Luthiel and scrambled up the slanted masonry to join Mosael. Below, in a valley of sinuous crimson grass, overgrown by copses of twisted trees, Ezekiel beheld what could have once been an ancient park. Sheets of blackened, writhing flesh blanketed the ground in between the patches of grass, and a river of viscous, red liquid bisected the valley, lined by nightmarish trees. There were at least 40 of them, perhaps 50. The houndsmen appeared to have been resting alongside the river. They had all turned to regard the knights who now stood, in full force, at the lip of the broken aqueduct. The men below were ragged, dressed in torn leathers and stained gambesons. Most wore hoods, tall pointed things with eye-holes cut directly into the fabric. 4 carts stood near the river. Degraded horses, wretched in complexion, were affixed to the wagons. The beasts were emaciated, their flesh draped over their bones. Sinister light shone from their eyes, and faint wisps of smoke wafted up from their many open sores. Within the wagons, Ezekiel saw an even more wretched sight. Each of the iron-shod carts, little more than barred cages on wheels, contained over a dozen naked bodies, all lashed together by heavy chains. The bodies, men, women, and children alike, were caked with blood and filth, and they shifted about, eternally unable to find any form of comfort. They gazed up towards Ezekiel and his brothers with hollow eyes. He set his jaw and felt hate boil within him. Pure, unbridled hate. It set his vision aflame. Drawing his sword, he felt the hilt fit snugly into his gauntlet. His grip tightened with anticipation. The savages below looked to each other for a few moments, before one of them, a warrior clad in a flowing red robe and hood, his face concealed behind a leering metal mask, roared something and gestured up at the Justicars with a tarnished sword. 6 more of the red-robed warriors stood among the degenerate savages. By comparison, their garb was almost clean and uniform. Another figure, corpulent and disfigured, stood out from the rest. A cloak of tanned human hide hung from around her shoulders, clasped around her neck by severed hands. The upper half of her face was obscured behind a mask of bone, decorated by a corona of interlocking metal bars that almost resembled the spokes of a broken wheel. She was naked from the waist up, and her flesh was pale and racked by infected sores, each surrounded by a knot of radiating crimson scars. She clutched a hide-bound grimoire in her swollen hands.
Kill the slaves of the false light!
She roared through rotten teeth, her voice little more than a deranged gurgle. Her blasphemy set Ezekiel's rage ablaze. His perception shifted, tightening. The savage host of madmen responded, lurching forwards with startling unison. Ezekiel flexed his sword arm with a snarl as his brothers readied their weapons. They had the high ground. Ezekiel did not know what suicidal madness compelled the houndsman to charge, but he welcomed it. Curling his lips into an enraged grimace, he called out for wrath, vengeance, and annihilation.
Alight the blood of the damned!
He roared, his voice raising above the chorus of deranged war cries, joining the similar incantations chanted by his brothers.
Alight the souls my steel has taken! Alight the souls I shall yet take!
His sword lit, golden flames engulfing the meteoric iron blade, as though the metal itself remembered its burning descent from the heavens. The weapons wielded by his brothers ignited in a similar fashion. The degenerates charged up towards them, heedless of what awaited. Luthiel and the Malak stood behind the line of 7 knights, unmoving, unfazed. Luthiel was no warrior, of course, but the confidence in her stance, as stooped and weakened as it was, revealed the truth of the matter. The houndsman would not reach her. A dozen more madmen appeared from a copse of twisted trees, and another 5 emerged from the rubble of a broken lodge alongside the grotesque river. That put their number at 60, at least. 60 houndsmen against 7 holy brothers of the Justicar Temple. It would be a massacre. Ezekiel grinned, just as the first of the houndsmen attempted to reach him. A single note resonated through the air, casting a ripple through the fog. The houndsmen slowed, and some of them looked behind the knights. Those that did screamed as burning light spread from their eyes, contouring the veins beneath their skin. That light turned to flame, vaporous and golden, as their corrupted blood immolated. Their screams distorted with a metallic pitch as fire consumed them. The note continued to resonate, and the remaining houndsmen wisely lowered their gazes, raising their hands before their eyes to shield them from the Malak's punishing stare. Some of those stumbled, they died in seconds, felled by the decisive blows of sword, mace, and hammer. One stumbled into Ezekiel, too disoriented to aim his improvised vulge properly. Ezekiel didn't need to sidestep the clumsy thrust. He pushed forward, stabbing his meteoric iron sword through the houndsman's ribs. Golden flame seared into the wound, and a moment later, the houndsman's blood immolated as furious light erupted from his open mouth and eyes. Taking a step down the slope, Ezekiel shouldered the burning corpse aside and wrenched his sword free, twisting the blade into a 2-handed grip as he swung it down at the second houndsman that ascended the rubble. The degenerate had the clarity to dodge, twisting away from the blow, but Ezekiel's strike came too fast and too precise. It sheared through the collar, biting all the way to the sternum. Blazing golden light coursed through the body, burning it out from within. A third houndsman slammed into Ezekiel, thrusting a dirk towards his ribs, attempting to pierce the mail in his armpit. Ezekiel twisted, and the blade skidded off. The houndsman's other weapon, a rusted hatchet, rang off his pauldron as Ezekiel thrust out with an armored elbow, catching the houndsman in the jaw with a crack of broken teeth. The man fell and rolled down the slope as a 4th madman leaped over his compatriot and brought a heavy-bladed timber axe down at Ezekiel's head. Ezekiel took the blow onto a curved pauldron. It glanced off, and even though the impact jarred him to the bone, he ignored it. His blood pumped as he wrenched his sword free of his second kill, using his boot as leverage. He followed the motion with an ergonomic thrust as he disemboweled the axe-wielding houndsman. Shouldering the screaming man aside, he let the golden light feast and continued advancing down the slope. Punching out towards a 5th houndsman, his gauntlet pulped the charging man's nose, sending him staggering back. Grinning with manic fury, Ezekiel gripped his blade in both hands and sheared the stunned wretch's hooded head from his shoulders. Black blood spattered across his armor, the droplets simmering to smoke as they touched the rune-inscribed metal.
And I shall reap the wicked,
Ezekiel roared as he took 2 steps forward, standing atop one of his burning victims.
For I am the wages of your sin.
A 6th houndsman rushed him, and Ezekiel lashed out, cleaving the wretch's arm off with a swift blow. His backswing opened the staggering warrior from shoulder to hip.
His glare is annihilation,
Ezekiel roared, his eyes wide with frantic fervor. He kicked the dying houndsman back and stepped towards the 7th, cleaving the charging degenerate's leg off at the thigh. His backswing severed the man's spine in mid-fall. Slashing down at his next foe, he felt a measure of surprise and glee as his attack was parried. One of the crimson-robed warriors pushed Ezekiel's sword aside and shouldered into him, halting his momentum. It was an aspirant, a squire of the damned, elevated from the filthy ranks of the dregs. Ezekiel grinned as he took another sword blow to the vambrace, feeling the armor dent as the aspirant laid into him with a series of brutal swings. Ezekiel parried most, and took another 2 onto his pauldron and gauntlet. An eighth houndsman leaped around him, repeatedly striking at his back and helm with the smithy's hammer. The blows rang, but Ezekiel ignored them. The aspirant was the greater threat. Slamming his boots into the red-robed warrior's scarred heater shield, Ezekiel sent the aspirant sprawling down the slope. And then, for a moment, Ezekiel was blinded as a flash of golden light illuminated the area. A ninth houndsman stumbled past him, collapsing as he gaped at a simmering hole pierced clean through his chest. Ezekiel took 2 more hammer blows as he turned to face his assailant, but something grabbed his leg and struck at his greaves with a sickle, trying to bury its point into the mail behind the knee joint. It was the second houndsman that he had sent tumbling from the ridge. He ended the crawling wretch's impotent defiance with a skull-fracturing boot to the head, spinning at the same moment to grab the hammer-wielding houndsman by the throat. The man struggled, clanging his hammer off Ezekiel's breastplate in feeble defiance until, with a roar, Ezekiel ripped open the houndsman's throat with his gauntlet. Ezekiel snarled, his lips curled back into a bloodthirsty grimace as he turned, just in time to receive the red-robed aspirant's charge. He parried the aspirant's thrust and riposted, only to have his own blow knocked aside by the warrior's shield. Rerouting his momentum into a murderous backswing, he caught the aspirant in the collar. His blade struck mail, but the blow staggered the warrior nonetheless. "Wilt beneath his glare!" Ezekiel roared as he delivered a savage follow-through, striking the staggered aspirant 5 times in rapid succession. Each blow struck plate or mail, but the sheer blunt trauma of the onslaught sent the warrior crumpling to his knees. Angling his sword to deliver a killing thrust, Ezekiel was halted as an unseen houndsman slammed into his flank. The man was burly and wore the remnants of a human skull as a mask, sewn onto the front of his leather hood. The houndsman raised a headsman's axe into a brutish swing. Ezekiel dodged just out of reach as the heavy blade scythed past him. Ezekiel recovered and sidestepped a descending blow that would have caved in his helmet. He countered, swinging savagely. His blade slammed into the brute's ringmail, cracking several links and sending him staggering back. Ezekiel followed through with a thrust into the man's throat. The tip of his burning sword punched clean through the back of the man's neck. The brute gurgled, falling back as his blood caught flame. Ezekiel wasted no time and turned to face the red-robed warrior once more. Much to his surprise, the aspirant rose to his feet. Gripping his weapon by hilt and blade, Ezekiel angled his sword and delivered a murderous half-sword thrust into the aspirant's mailed throat. It pierced and sunk into flesh. Golden light blossomed from behind the eye slits of the aspirant's metal mask, and finally the warrior slumped, dead. Spinning, Ezekiel saw no more enemies in his nearby vicinity, and allowed himself a moment of respite. He stumbled, briefly overcome by the weight of his armor and the pain of his open sores. New bruises added to the symphony of discomfort, and in an instant, he felt a terrible disgust at the massacre surrounding him. Another score of houndsmen had evidently been hiding somewhere, perhaps in the trees or perhaps in the grass. They assailed his brothers, who similarly advanced down the hill, leaving a swath of smoldering bodies in their wake. Each of the Justicars fought alone. Some houndsmen bypassed the knights, rushing at Luthiel or the Malak. They died. The Malak stood like a beacon of irradiant death atop the broken aqueduct, its face ever concealed behind its pale shroud. Its 4 wings were splayed wide open, revealing all of its eyes, and its strange silver lantern was held aloft, its dire light mercifully shuttered. The Malak's manifold gaze blazed with iridescent wrath, and wispy trails of gleaming violet smoke traced the battlefield, emanating from the eyes and mouths of the dead, spiraling towards the Malak. The smoky lights swirled around the divine being, before being sucked into the vents of the strange lantern. Turning, Ezekiel righted himself as he saw the bloated witch leading the houndsman stumble away, finally realizing her folly. 2 red-robed warriors attempted to intercept Sathariel and Mosael, who advanced upon her. Sathariel dismantled one, killing it with a series of brutal strikes from his polehammer, while Mosael traded blows with the other. Sathariel advanced on the retreating witch, confident that his brother would prevail. After a moment, Mosael disarmed the aspirant with a bash of his shield before caving the warrior's skull in with his flanged mace. Both aspirants simmered, tongues of flame escaping from the holes in their masks. A blur of motion caught Ezekiel's gaze, and he turned just as another houndsman rushed at him, screaming profanity from his frothing mouth. With a quick, dismissive slash, Ezekiel opened the warrior's throat and shouldered the corpse aside. Breath heaving and heart pounding, he advanced towards what remained of the fight, his sabatons crunching into flesh and bone. Nothing cried out beneath him. The Justicars left no survivors. Smoke coiled around him, and a strange metallic hiss filled the air as wisps of violet writhed across the battlefield towards the Malak's lantern. Ezekiel grit his teeth at the sound, feeling a cold shiver ripple through him. Advancing towards the bloated witch, he saw her raise a hide-bound tome in both of her hands, holding the pages out towards Sathariel in the vain hope that the blasphemy scrawled across it might halt him. Sothariel's polehammer crushed the witch's forearm, sending the tome to the ground in a flutter of torn pages. The witch screamed and roared a gurgling string of curses as Sothariel's backswing embedded the reverse spike of his polearm into her ribs. Mosael closed in, flanking the witch as he brought his mace down repeatedly, silencing her deranged cries. The paltry dozen houndsmen that still stood, unengaged with the Justicars, stopped, looking about in confusion. Ezekiel could not see their faces, concealed as they were behind their pointed hoods, but he could see the terror in their eyes. Ezekiel advanced towards the survivors. 2 turned and fled. 1 raised a mallet to face him. Ezekiel snarled and brought his sword down in a cleaving arc. The houndsman parried, remarkably, and returned with a savage swipe of his own, glancing off Ezekiel's pauldron. Rolling his shoulder, Ezekiel's follow-through spilled the houndsman's smoking innards across the blighted field. Without pause, he took his sword in both hands and beheaded the 4th, who stared dumbfounded up at the malak. The other 2 didn't make it far. Both fell as a searing ray of light swept down from atop the aqueduct, nearly cutting each of them in 2. Ezekiel grinned beneath his barbute, his teeth clenched, his eyes wide and bloodshot. More houndsmen were fleeing in the distance, towards a dense copse of trees across the river. Javanael moved to intercept them, but he was too slow. Ezekiel broke into a run, feeling the fury stoke once more. He could chase them down. They wouldn't be able to cross the bloody river in time. He could trap them there before Javanael's lazy pace even reached them, and then he could butcher them all by himself. His charge brought him right past one of the prisoner wagons. The naked, tortured bodies grasped at him, pleading. His fury evaporated. He halted, his sword's point dropping into the oozing mud. The houndsmen fled, wading across the gruesome river. 1 fell and was instantly enveloped by a host of barbed, entrail-like vines. His screams echoed strangely. The others made it across, but Ezekiel no longer cared. He looked down at his gauntlets. They were spattered in steaming blood. Droplets and splashes of it coated his armor, smoking as the corruption within it touched the runes marked upon his plate. The wretched souls in the slave wagons recoiled from him, and he imagined what they might see. A gore-spattered revenant, faceless in his soiled warplate. He imagined they could feel the hate radiating from him, thirsting to purge and slaughter all things corrupt and wicked. Ezekiel balked. The tortured souls in the cages were corrupt, undoubtedly. They'd been exposed for Elohim knew how long. He would have to... He shook his head, feeling the last vestiges of the comforting hate and fury melt away. Taking a step back, he felt a gauntlet clank against his pauldron.
"Steady, brother,"
Meshniel said, his voice degraded further to a rasping cough.
"Don't let it eat you alive."
It almost had. He'd given in. He'd partaken in slaughter for slaughter's sake. The folk he'd butchered were vile creatures, no doubt, and he would never regret putting heretics as twisted as houndsmen to the sword. But the way he'd done it, the way he'd reveled. Inhibition was dying. Conviction was fraying. Sanity was unraveling. The inversion would take him soon. Of that Ezekiel was sure. He simply did not know how long he had. Meshniel walked past him, keeping his visor down as he looked towards the cages.
"Lord Sothariel,"
he called. Sothariel strode over, along with the rest of the knights. Ezekiel turned and bowed his head as he saw the malak descending from the ridge with Luthiel in tow. He caught sight of the golden glow, simmering from the eyeholes in Luthiel's mask. The same light seeped from her bandages and hissed from her mouth slit. Thoughts of his own impending doom fled, and he sheathed his sword, moving to aid her, giving the malak a wide berth. He felt the being's presence against his skin, hot and chafing. It was as though it knew.
"Luthiel,"
he said, ignoring the discomfort and putting a steadying hand on her shoulder as she nearly stumbled, crossing over a pile of mutilated houndsmen.
You used it."
She nodded, slowly, keeping one of her arms folded tightly across her chest and clutching its elbow with her other hand. The bandages were smoking and bled through completely. Ezekiel sighed. He trailed off. What could he say to her? What could he chide her on after what he'd just done? Luthiel looked at him, sorrow evident in her hollow gaze.
"I would rather it consume me than this place."
To that, Ezekiel nodded, though it pained his soul to do so. Somewhere deep within his fraying psyche, he wished that he, too, could have such an ending within reach. But he was only a man. His soul was nothing more than that, just a soul. Luthiel was a vessel for something greater. Her soul, an anchor for the living light of God. Ezekiel turned as Luthiel tugged him towards the slave caravan. The Malak and his 6 brothers stood before them. They hadn't opened the cages. Some of the slaves clawed at the bars, shouting, pleading. Some were praying, uttering a chorus of thanks and praise, recognizing the Justicars and the Malak for what they were. All kept their gazes averted. They could not look upon the Malak. Most of the slaves were marked with open sores. Crimson scar tissue radiated from the wounds, spiraling outward in a counterclockwise fashion like sickening maelstrom patterns. Ezekiel's lips curled in disgust. The anathema's sign. It was on all of them. He shuddered. It was on him as well. Ezekiel caught sight of some of the slaves, cowering in the back of the carts, shielding their eyes and crying out for mercy. Some sobbed silently. Some made no sound at all. He could see dread in their eyes, acceptance in some. They understood. Sathariel nodded grimly towards the Malak. Mesashesh, do what must be done. There was only one kind of mercy that could be offered to those who had been exposed. It was a mercy that Ezekiel and his brothers would never have the opportunity to know. He closed his eyes as the Malak sang. A singular, resonant note ripped through the air. It sang to the blood. It sang to the soul. But it was not the only note Ezekiel heard. There was another, emanating somewhere deep within Luthiel's dying body, echoing up through her flesh and radiating through her mouth and eyes. Ezekiel hummed to the second note, attuning his vocal cords and his blood to the sound that would protect him. His brothers joined him. The Malak's note compelled the blood. The blood beckoned the animus. The animus tugged upon the eidolon, and the eidolon and the thought it carried compelled the muscle. Ezekiel could not see, but he knew exactly what was happening. He'd borne witness to it before. The Malak's song forced the slaves to look upon it. And then it opened its eyes. All 28 of them. Screams echoed, barely heard amidst the twin notes. Flames roared, and cries for salvation were torn from open throats, carrying through the air in a phantasmal rush of burning wind. The anima, torn from the bodies of the imprisoned slaves, coiled through the air. The chorus shifted pitch as the voices distorted, becoming louder than the note that ended them. And then, with a whistling metallic hiss, all fell silent. The humming stopped. Ezekiel opened his eyes. He was greeted by silence and the stench of charred corpses. The slaves were dead. Their bodies were burnt from inside. Some still knelt. All looked towards the Malak with smoking eye sockets, their mouths agape. Faint light still glowed from within them. The Malak lowered its lantern and strode past the cages.
We spared them, the furnace,
Luthiel whispered.
Their souls will wait, protected, until the day this land might be reclaimed again.
Ezekiel did not know what to think. All he could feel was guilt. Those people had looked to him and his brothers for salvation, and all they'd received was death. Come, Sathariel said, sorrow clear in his voice. Let us go. We will honor the dead by completing our task. Ezekiel said nothing, and followed his brothers deeper into the city, leaving the carnage behind him. He doubted there would be any way to honor the dead, and he was fairly certain the dead couldn't care less about Sathariel's vow. He knew they'd only wanted to live, to have a chance at escaping and returning to the lives they'd been stolen from. As his sabatons crunched through the ash and trod over the charred bones of the corpse city, Ezekiel felt the death weigh down upon him. Those people back there had looked to him as a savior. That was what they'd been told about the Knights Justicar. His order was noble. His order brought salvation to the people of the Covenant. His order saved. But not today. Not in this place. Today, the Knights Justicar brought only death. Where that truth led his thoughts was even more sickening. Ezekiel would never again save. Up until the moment when either death or corruption finally claimed his soul, the only thing he would ever give again to another living being was death. That is the end of Chapter 2, Death for the Wretched. Thank you for listening to this second episode of The Broken Covenant. If you've enjoyed it, then I duly hope you'll give it a like and stick around as the story continues. More will come, and over the next 2 episodes, the narrative will explore the conclusion of Ezekiel's enigmatic quest and set the stage for what is to come. Until next time, farewell, and stay sane.